Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition, and we are going to continue our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And we're making a lot of progress. This is about a 600 some odd pages. And I think we're about halfway through, almost there, almost halfway. And thank you so much for sticking with us. You guys are a trooper. And I'm just going to move the camera in here a little bit. Okay, let's see here. Okay, I'm just trying to get my bearings together. Make sure I have the right spot here. And while you're here, check out our other book clubs. We're starting a new two new books in August. First one is the spiritual edition, which is on Mondays. And then we're starting a new health book in the health book club on Wednesdays. So you could check us out there. And of course, Thursdays are financial edition. And I think this book is so large, The Creature from Jekyll Island. It's about 600 some odd pages. It'll take us through the end of the year, or I think the beginning of next year. So, anyways, okay, so check us out. And all right, here we go. A side trip through World War II. Returning to the trail of actual events since that time, let us pause briefly to take a short side trip through World War II. Financing and profiting from both sides in a conflict has never been more blatant. Item: from the beginning of Hitler's rise to power, German industry was heavily financed by American and British bankers. Well, most of the largest U.S. corporations were knowingly invested in war industries. IG Farben was the largest of the industrial cartels and was a primary source of political funding for Hitler. It was Farben that staffed and directed Hitler's intelligence section and ran the Nazi slave labor camps as a supplemental source of manpower for Germany's factories. Farben even hired the New York public relations firm of Ivy Lee, who was John D. Rockefeller's PR specialist, to help improve Hitler's public image in America. Lee, incidentally, had also been used to help sell the Soviet regime to the American public in the late 1920s. And that footnote was from Anthony Sutton, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Seal Beach, California, 76 Press, 1976, page 15 to 18, 33 to 43, 67 to 97, 99 to 113. Also, Revolution, page 174. Item: much of the capital for the expansion of IG Farben came from Wall Street, primarily Rockefeller's National City Bank, Dillon, Reed and Company, also a Rockefeller firm, Morgan's Equitable Trust Company, Harris Forbes and Company, and yes, the predominantly Jewish firm of Kuhn Loeb and Company. And that quote was from Sutton. Hitler, page 23 to 61. Item: during the Allied bombing raids over Germany, the factories and administrative buildings of IG Farben were spared. The U.S. War Department, which determined bombing priorities, was liberally staffed with men who, in civilian life, had been associates of the investment firms previously mentioned. For example, Undersecretary of War at that time was Robert P. Patterson. James Forrestal was Secretary of the Navy and later became Secretary of Defense. Both men had come from Dillon Reed, and in fact, Forrestal had been president of that firm. Item: during World War II, under the Under the Lend-Lease program, the United States sent to the Soviets more than $11 billion in aid, including 14,000 aircraft, nearly 500,000 tanks and other military vehicles, more than 400 combat ships, and even half of the entire U.S. supply of uranium, which then was critically needed for the development of the atomic bomb. But fully one-third of all the Lend-Lease shipments during this period comprised industrial equipment and supplies to be used for the development of the Russian economy after the war. And when the war did end, the Lend-Lease program continued to flow into the Soviet Union for over a year. As late as the end of 1946, Russia was still receiving 20-year credit terms at 2 and 3/8% interest. That's an odd number, 2 and 3/8. A far lower rate than returning GIs could obtain. And that footnote was from Anthony C. Sutton, National Suicide, Military Aid to the Soviet Union. New Rochelle, New York, Arlington House, 1973, page 24. The transfusion mechanism. With the termination of the Lend-Lease program, it was necessary to invent new mechanisms for the support of Soviet Russia and her satellites. One of these was the sale of much needed commodities at prices below the world market, and in fact, below the prices that Americans themselves had to pay for the same items. This meant, of course, as it did in the case of Lend-Lease, that the American taxpayer had to make up the difference. The Soviets were not even required to have money to buy these goods. American financial institutions, the federal government, the international agencies, which are largely funded by the federal government, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, lent the money to them. Furthermore, the interest rates on these loans also are below the market, requiring still additional subsidy by American citizens. Boy, America is just subsidizing everybody and everything under the sun. What's that phrase that people use a lot? Everybody and everyone and their mother or and their grandmother and their aunt. Boy, no wonder America's in trouble. Sorry, a little side note there. And that is not all. Almost all of these loans have been guaranteed by the United States government, which means that if, no, make that when, these countries default in their payments, the gullible American public is once again called upon to make them good. In other words, the new mechanism, innocently and deceptively referred to as trade, is little more than a thinly disguised means by which members of the Round Table who direct our national policies have bled billions of dollars from American citizens for an ongoing economic transfusion into the Soviet bloc, and continue to do so now that the word Soviet has been changed to the less offensive democratic socialism. Boy, isn't that interesting? Democratic socialism. That is Bernie Sanders and AOC's term, isn't it? Party, isn't it? They're always playing word games. They switch, if a word is, if the public starts to say, oh, this word is not good, then they'll kind of change it, soften it up a little bit, make it sound nicer, right? A lot of euphemisms and wordplay. This enables these regimes, this enables those regimes to enter into contracts with American businessmen to provide essential services. And the circle is complete from the American taxpayer to the American government to the quote socialist regime to the American businessman and ultimately to the American financier who funded the project and provided the political influence to make it all possible. Hence comes the phrase, or originates the phrase, money makes the world go round. This is the key to understanding the transfusion mechanism. Many Americans have looked at this process and have jumped to the conclusion that there must be a nest of communist agents within our government. In an exam on reality politics, they would receive half credit for that answer. Yes, there undoubtedly have been and continue to be red agents and sympathizers burrowed deep into our government woodwork, and they're all too happy to help the process along. But the main motive force has always come from the non communist, non democratic socialist, non American, non anything members of the Roundtable Network who, as Lenin said, in the pursuit of profit, are laboring for the preparation of their own suicide. It's all about the money, eh? These men are incapable of genuine patriotism. Well, their only patriotism is money. Almighty dollar, right? As they say. They think of themselves not as citizens of any particular country, but as citizens of the world. They can do business just as easily with bloodthirsty dictatorships as with any other government, especially since they are assured by the transfer mechanism that the American taxpayer is going to make good on the deal. When David Rockefeller was asked about the propriety of providing funding for Marxist and communist countries which are openly hostile to the United States, he responded, quote, I don't think an international bank such as ours ought to try to set itself as a judge about what kind of government a country wishes to have, end quote. Wishes to have? He was talking about Angola, where the Marxist dictatorship was forced upon the people with Cuban soldiers and Soviet weapons. Thomas Theobald, vice president of Citicorp, was asked in 1981 about his bank's loans to Poland. Was he embarrassed by making loans to a communist party, especially following the regime's brutal repression of free trade unions? Not at all. Quote, who knows which political system works? End quote, he replied. Quote, the only test we care about is can they pay their bills? End quote. What he meant, of course, was can the American taxpayer pay Poland's bills? Item. The following item, taken directly from the Los Angeles Times just a few months after Theobald's statement, tells the story. Washington, for months, the Reagan administration has been using federal funds to repay Polish loans owed to U.S. banks, and the bill for this fiscal year may amount to $400 million. Deputy Secretary of Agriculture Richard E. Ling said Monday. Quote, they, which is the Polish authorities, have not been making payments for at least the last half of the year, Ling said. When they don't make a payment, the U.S. Department of Agriculture makes a payment. Ling said the United States government or the U.S. government paid $60 million to $70 million a month on guaranteed Polish loans in October, November, December, and January. And, quote, we will continue to pay them. And that quote was from U.S. Repaying Loans Owed by Poland to American Banks by William J. Eaton, Los Angeles Times, February 2nd, 1982. This, remember, was precisely at the time the Polish government had declared martial law and was using military force to crush workers' demonstrations for political reform. The Polish default on this $1.6 billion loan was by no means an isolated event. Communist Romania and a multitude of Latin American countries were soon to follow. The hard fact is that American taxpayers unknowingly have been making monthly bank payments on behalf of communist, socialist, and so-called third world countries for many years. And with the more recent staging of apparent reform within the former Soviet bloc, Congress has tripped all over itself to greatly accelerate that trend. Americans, of course, want to believe that the evil empire is crumbling, and the Soviets turned Democrats play directly to that desire. Since the end of World War II, the primary objectives have been one, to disarm us, and two, to get our money. The facade of perestroika and glasnost has been merely employed to accomplish both objectives at once. All they have had to do is to get rid of a few of the old hardliners, replace them with less well-known personalities who are essentially the same. All of the new leaders come from the ranks of the old leadership, change their labels from quote communists to quote social democrats, and then sit back while we happily tear down our military defenses and rush billions of dollars to their failing economies. There undoubtedly will be some progress allowed in the area of free speech, but the military and security organizations continue in full readiness. The iron fist beneath the velvet glove remains ready to strike when the time comes that the facade is no longer necessary. Boy, we're seeing that glove come off now, isn't it? With the social democrats right out in the open, no longer clandestine. Even if the entire ploy were genuine, there is no reason to believe that these social democracies will ever become better investment risks. The primary thing that has held them back economically is in the past is their socialist system. And that most definitely will not be changed. All of the new, quote, anti-communist social democrats have pledged their loyalty to the principles of Marx and have said in plain language that they will use our money to develop, not abandon socialism. These countries will continue to be unproductive and will continue to be unable to pay their loans. The American taxpayers will continue to be forced by the cabal to pay the bills. Item. Before the Bolshevik coup d'etat, Russia was one of the most productive agricultural nations in the world. The great wheat fields in Ukraine justly earned her the title of the breadbasket of Europe. But when the people's utopia arrived, agriculture came to a standstill and famine stalked the land. Even after Stalin, when the regime is said to have adopted more humane and productive policies, Russia never produced enough food for itself. A nation that cannot feed its citizens cannot develop its industry, and it certainly cannot build a potent military force. It is not surprising, therefore, that for decades the United States had annually sold tens of millions of tons of wheat and other foodstuffs to Russia. The quote marks are to emphasize, the quote marks around sold. So United States has annually, quote, sold tens of millions of tons of wheat. The quote marks are to emphasize the underlying transfusion mechanism previously described. Item. The American government industrial complex provided the Soviets with the money, technology, and the actual construction of two of the world's largest and most modern truck plants. The Kama River plant and the ZIL plant produce over 150,000 heavy-duty trucks per year, including armored personnel carriers and missile launchers, plus 250,000 diesel engines, many of which are used to power Soviet tanks. 45% of the cost of this project came from the U.S. Export-Import Bank, an agency of the federal government, and an equal amount from David Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank. The Soviets put up only 10%. The loan, of course, was taxpayer guaranteed by the U.S. Import-Export Bank, which at the time was under the direction of William Casey. Casey later was appointed as head of the CIA to protect America from global communism. Are you beginning to get the picture? And that quote was from U.S. Builds Soviet War Machine, Industrial Research and Development, July 1980, page 51 to 54. Item. Almost every important facet of Eastern Bloc heavy industry could well be stamped, quote, made in the USA. With the specific approval of each successive president, we have provided the latest oil drilling equipment, chemical processing plants, air traffic radar systems, equipment to produce precision bearings, large craft helicopter engines, laser technologies, highly advanced computer systems, and nuclear power plants. We have trained hundreds of their technicians in American institutions and factories and have provided their astronauts with the spacesuits developed by NASA. We have even trained their pilots at U.S. Air Force bases and paid for their military officers to attend our war college. All of this has been used by the Russian government, as Lenin predicted it would, to build their military industry in preparation for an attack on their suppliers. The great pretense of crumbling communism has not altered that strategy. It is the brilliant implementation of it. Item: when Boris Yeltsin seized control of the former Soviet government, one of his first official acts was to decree that foreign businesses have the right to take the profits out of the country. From a purely business perspective, that was a sound move because it would provide incentive for foreign investment. But there was more to it than that. Recall from the previous chapter that the lion's share of that investment was to be funded by by American taxpayers in the form of direct aid, bank loan bailouts, and uh, government insurance through the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Jane Ingram provides the details. During 1992, Yeltsin wheeled and dealed with Royal Dutch Shell, British Petroleum, Amoco, Texaco, and Exxon. The Chevron joint venture to develop the Tengiz oil field was signed. McDermott International, Marathon Oil, and Mitsui signed a contract with the Russian government to develop oil and natural gas off Sakhalin Island. Chevron and Oman formed a consortium to build a huge pipeline to carry crude oil from Kazakhstan to the Black Sea, Mediterranean, and Persian Gulf. Occidental Petroleum signed a joint venture with Russia to modernize two oil fields in Siberia. Newmont Mining signed a joint venture to extract gold in Uzbekistan. Merrill Lynch's chairman, William Schreier, CFR, signed up as financial advisor to, quote, aid in privatizing, end quote, the Ukrainian State Property Fund. AT&T CEO Robert Allen, CFR-TC, which is the Trilateral Commission, signed a huge contract to supply switching systems for all of Kazakhstan. U.S. West joined with the Hungarian government to own and operate a national cellular telephone system. GM Vice President Marina Whitman, CFR-TC, joined the governments of Hungary and Yugoslavia to make cars. GE CEO John Welch, CFR, and Vice Chairman of the Board Lawrence Bossidy, TC, bought a majority stake in Hungary's lighting industry. Ralston Purina, Dow Chemical, Eastern Kodak, SC Johnson and Son, Xerox, American Express, Procter & Gamble, Woolworth, Philip Morris, Ford, Compaq Computer. Hardly a single American brand name was missing. Wow, that's incredible. The Payoff. Oh, that quote was from The Payoff by Jane H. Ingram. The New American, June 28, 1993, page 25 and 26. Okay. I'm going to take a sip of my tea here real quick. My mouth is getting a little dry. All right. Item. In February of 1996, the Clinton administration made a $1 billion loan of U.S. taxpayers' money to Russia's state-controlled Aeroflot company so it could more effectively compete with American companies such as Boeing in the building of jumbo jets. By the end of that year, the former Soviet bloc countries had received transfusions from the World Bank of over $3 billion. By mid 2000, it was clear that Russian officials had laundered an additional $7 billion from IMF loans through the Bank of New York. Yet, new loans, quote unquote loans, continue to follow. Item. Now the action has spread to China. American banks and businessmen, with taxpayers standing by with guarantees, have provided power generating equipment, steel mills, and electronic gear to update Russian made jet fighters. All of this is explained as a means of weaning the red Chinese away from another Russia and encouraging them to move closer to free enterprise capitalism. Yeah, right. Yet in 1985, at the height of the frenzy over building trade bridges to China, the regime signed a $14 billion trade pact with Russia, and in 1986 sent a $20 million interest-free loan to the communist Sandinistas in Nicaragua. Even after the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre in Beijing, when U.S. officials were publicly condemning China for human rights violations, business quietly continued as usual. Of course, quote, the United States cannot condone the violent attacks and cannot ignore the consequence for our relationship with China, unquote, said President Bush. Yet, within only a few weeks of the bloodshed, and at the very time that student leaders were being executed, the administration approved a $200 million low-interest loan for delivery of 4 of Boeing's newest jumbo jet aircraft. In 1993, 47 more jetliners were sold. With a projected sale of 800 more over the next 15 years. Amoco is spending $1.5 billion to develop oil fields in the China Sea. A joint venture between the Chinese government and Chrysler is building military jeeps. A similar joint project is upgrading their F-8 fighter planes. 3 communication satellites were cleared for delivery. AT&T contracted a $30 million cellular communications network. China's interest in military technology is revealing. In addition to the advanced hardware purchased from the United States, the Chinese have bought MiG-31 and Su-27 jet fighters from Russia and an aircraft carrier constructed in Ukraine. In May of 1992, China set off its biggest underground nuclear blast. In 1997, the purchase list was extended to include self-propelled gun mortar systems and Russia's most advanced diesel-electric submarines. Although it is known that China maintains a slave labor workforce in excess of 1 million people, they call them, quote, convicts. And although the Tariff Act of 1930 prohibits the United States from importing any goods made even in part by convicts or other forced labor, every administration, starting with Nixon, has renewed the, quote, most favored nation trade status for China. How is China expected to pay for all this, quote, trade? Very simple. By 1996, China had become the largest single recipient of guaranteed loans and subsidies from World Bank. Item. In addition to these decades of global trade, credit, and taxpayer guarantees, the United States has transferred tens of billions of dollars in direct foreign aid grants with no pretense at all regarding expectation of repayment. Why is this done? In June of 2000, President Clinton spoke before the Russian parliament and provided the answer. He said, quote, the United States wants a strong Russia. He said that? Huh. I wonder why. The next day, he announced that the United States, the US, would give $78 million to improve the Chernobyl atomic power plant in Kiev. The trail leads to Wall Street, and the tracks are fresh. The Round Table Network did succeed in exploiting the markets of Eastern Europe and continues to do so today. The cast of characters has changed, but the play remains the same. In the beginning, the Council of Foreign Relations was dominated by J.P. Morgan. It is still controlled by international financiers. The Morgan Group gradually has been replaced by the Rockefeller Consortium, and the roll call of participating businesses now reads like the Fortune 500. The operation no longer pretends to be a Red Cross mission. It now masquerades under the cover of, quote, East-West trade. Politicians are fond of talking about the necessity of preserving world peace. And trade, we are told, is one of the best ways to do it. The implication is that this is a time of peace. In truth, we live in one of the most war-torn eras the world has ever seen. No continent today except Antarctica is free from war. Well, Antarctica that we know of, there might be stuff going underneath Antarctica that we don't know of. But anyways, we'll take the author's word at face value for now. No continent today except Antarctica is free from war. There are from 25 to 40 military struggles going on somewhere every day of the year. There have been more than 150 armed conflicts since the end of World War II, with the death count already in excess of 20 million and rising. We cannot help noticing that this also has been a period of rising government debt and the global creation of fiat money. And that footnote was from, these figures were taken from United Nations publication E/CN .5/1985 /Rev 1. I don't know what all those initials and stuff mean, but anyways. 1985 report on the world social situation, page 14. More recent editions of that document do not give cumulative figures, but show that the number of conflicts has been accelerating. So the current numbers, whatever they may be, are even worse. The new alchemy. The alchemists of ancient times vainly sought the philosopher's stone, which they believed would turn lead into gold. Is it possible that such a stone actually has been found? Can it be that the money alchemists of our own time have learned how to transmute war into debt and debt into war, and both into gold for themselves? In a previous section, we theorized a strategy dubbed the Rothschild formula, in which the world's money cabal deliberately encourages war as a means of stimulating the profitable production of armaments and of keeping nations perpetually in debt. This is not profit-seeking, it is genocide. It is not a trivial matter, therefore, to inquire into the possibility that our elected and non-elected leaders are, in fact, implementing the Rothschild formula today. Item. In his address to the graduating class at Annapolis in 1983, Secretary of the Navy John Lehman said, quote, "Within weeks, many of you will be looking across just hundreds of feet of water at some of the most modern technology ever invented in America. Unfortunately, it is on Soviet ships," end quote. As Professor Sutton observed in his book, The Best Enemy Money Can Buy, the guns, the ammunition, the weapons, and the transportation systems that killed Americans in Korea and Vietnam came from the American subsidized economy of the Soviet Union. The trucks that carried these weapons down the Ho Chi Minh Trail were manufactured in American-built plants. The ships that carried the supplies to Sihanoukville, and Haiphong, and later to Angola. To Angola. And Nicaragua came from NATO allies and used propulsion systems that our State Department could have kept out of Soviet hands. Sutton concludes, quote, the technical capability to wage the Korean and Vietnamese wars originated on both sides in Western and mainly American technology, and the political illusion of, quote, peaceful trade, end quote, promoted by the deaf, mute, blind men, was the carrier for this war-making technology, end quote. And that quote was from Anthony Sutton, The Best Enemy Money Can Buy. Billings, Montana, Liberty House Press, 1986, page 191. Item. That leads us to the more recent wars in the Middle East and the rise of, quote, Islamic fundamentalism. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Algeria, and PLO. The PLO is what? People's Liberation something or other. The Muslim Brotherhood and similar anti-American groupings have all received weapons, funding, and clandestine support from the U.S. government. In the Gulf War, every effort was made to ensure that Hussein's regime was contained but not destroyed. Shades of the Korean and Vietnam Wars. His military infrastructure and most of his weapons were spared. After the ceasefire, he was allowed to keep his fleet of helicopter gunships, which he promptly used to put down a large-scale internal revolt. The big pill to swallow is that for many years, Hussein was an asset to the global planners in the West, and they did everything possible to keep him in power. It was only when he refused to allow U.S. companies to dominate Iraqi oil production that he was seriously targeted. Prior to that, he was untouchable precisely because he was widely received as he was widely perceived as a perfect, despicable enemy. As mentioned previously, the talent pool for the implementation of the strategy has been the Council on Foreign Relations. In 1996, the managing editor of the CFR's journal, Foreign Affairs, was Fareed Zakaria, who offered the following rationalization. Yes, it's tempting to get rid of Saddam, but his bad behavior actually serves America's purposes in the region. If Saddam Hussein did not exist, we would have to invent him. The end of Saddam Hussein would be the end of the anti-Saddam coalition. Nothing destroys an alliance like the disappearance of the enemy. Maintaining a long-term American presence in the Gulf would be difficult in the absence of a regional threat. And that quote was from Thank Goodness for a Villain, Newsweek, September 16, 1996, page 43. That is about as clear a statement of the Rothschild formula as one is apt to find. Excuse me. Yet, many people cannot believe it is real. Even congressmen. For example, Representative James Trafficant from Ohio, speaking before the House on April 29, 1997, exclaimed, America gives billions to Russia. With American cash, Russia builds missiles. Russia then sells those missiles to China. And China, who gets about $45 billion in trade giveaways from Uncle Sam, then sells those Russian-made missiles to Iran. Now, Iran, with those Russian-made missiles sold to them by China, threatens the Middle East. Threatens the Mideast. So, Uncle Sam sends more troops and sends more dollars. Mr. Speaker, this is not foreign policy. This is foreign stupidity. And that quote was from Congressional Record, April 29, 1997. A side note there, I just had a thought. They said the one who holds the gold, what's that phrase? The one who holds the gold rules. And the one who provides the cash, so the creditor, the one who has the cash is the creditor. And when the creditor loans money to the creditor owns the debtor. It's just a thought. So I wonder, America is loaning money left and right to all sides. They own all those countries at the end at the end of the day. Just a thought. Anyways, interesting, eh? Trifficant was on target seeing the problem, but he missed the bullseye with the cause. CFR policymakers are not stupid. They are implementing the Rothschild formula. To justify world government, there must be wars. Wars require enemies with frightful weapons. Iran is one of the best enemies money can buy. Item. The latest act in this play is the buildup of North America. Its nuclear capabilities come from China and Russia, both of which receive U.S. trade investments and technology. While President Bush was saying that North Korea was part of the, quote, axis of evil, his administration was sending its so-called humanitarian shipments of food, which the regime used to strengthen its control. We must assume that Western leaders have considered Lenin's prediction that by funding their enemies, they are preparing their own suicide. Ours also, by the way. We must also conclude they are confident of avoiding that fate. Whether they are right or wrong is not the issue here. The point is they believe they are correct, and they are building a world order which they think they can. Now they plan to do that is the subject, how they plan to do that is the subject of a later section. But perpetual war is an important part of it. Fifth reason to abolish the system. There are few historians who would challenge the fact that the funding of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War was accomplished by the Mandrake mechanism through the Federal Reserve System. An overview of all wars since the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694 suggests that most of them would have been greatly reduced in severity, or perhaps not even fought at all without fiat money. It is the ability of governments to acquire money without direct taxation that makes modern warfare possible, and the central bank has become the preferred method of accomplishing that. One can argue the necessity, or at least the inevitability, of fiat money in time of war as a means of raw survival. That is the primal instinct of both individuals and governments. All other considerations aside, we shall leave that for the philosophers. But there can be no debate over the fact that fiat money in time of peace has no such justification. Furthermore, the ability of governments and banking institutions to use fiat money to fund the wars of other nations is a powerful temptation for them to become embroiled in those wars for personal profit, political advancement, or other reasons which fall far short of a moral justification for bloodshed. The Federal Reserve System has always served that function. The ongoing strategy of building up the military capabilities of America's potential enemies leaves us no reason to believe we have seen the last of war. Therefore, it is not an exaggeration to say that the Federal Reserve System encourages war. There can be no better reason for the creature to be put to sleep. An extension of the Federal Reserve System would be the BIS, Bank of International Settlement, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and other banking systems, right? Oops. Okay, summary. The Bolshevik Revolution was a coup d'etat in which a radical minority captured the Russian government from the moderate revolutionary majority. The Red Cross Mission of New York financiers threw support to the Bolsheviks and in turn received economic rewards in the form of rights to Russia's natural resources plus contracts for construction and supplies. The continued participation in the economic development of Russia and Eastern Europe since that time indicates that this relationship has survived to the present day. These financiers are not pro-communist. Their motivation is profit and power. They're now working to bring both Russia and the United States into a world government which they expect to control. War and threats of war are tools to prod the masses toward the acceptance of that goal. It is essential, therefore, that the United States and the industrialized nations of the world have credible enemies. As these words are being written, Russia is wearing the mask of peace and cooperation, but we have seen that before. We may yet see a return of the evil empire when the timing is right. US government and mega bank funding, first of Russia and now of Chinese and Middle East military capabilities, cannot be understood without this insight. Wow. I enjoyed this book a lot because it gives history. I think history is important. You learn, the idea is you learn about history so you don't repeat it. But, I think humanity is, number one, has amnesia or short memory. We forget easy. And number two, we have a tendency to do things over and over and over again, expecting the same result, which is the definition of insanity, right? Interesting. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. We will continue our reading next week with a new chapter. So in the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day and we'll see you next time. All right. Bye-bye now.